Hi, I'm Steve McGraw. I'm the General Manager for the San Mateo County Harbor District. This is the second of a series of public meetings about the districted election movement that the district has undertaken. This will be completed in plenty of time for the 2020 election, but not for this coming November 6, 2018 election. The district has retained Redistricting Partners, and Paul Mitchell from Redistricting Partners is here this evening to give a presentation about the process and the underpinnings of the California Voting Rights Act. I'd like to recognize in the audience Board President Virginia Chancarelli. But with that, I'll introduce Paul Mitchell.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. My name is Paul Mitchell. I'm the owner of Redistricting Partners. I've worked on California Voting Rights Act analysis and districting and redistricting around the state and done some work around the country in redistricting. I'm going to go through a presentation that looks at what is districting, what is the California Voting Rights Act, what are some of the terms that we're going to be using in the districting process, and then go through a little bit about the district and some of the things that we might be looking at in the districting process. Ultimately, the hope with these public meetings and having these being taped and put on TV, and also with future board meetings and public meetings, is the ability to get input from board members or the public as to how different criteria will be weighted when the lines are actually drawn for each of the district seats. So districting is the process of taking an at-large election area like a city or a county supervisors or something like that and breaking it up into parts where each of the parts elects one member to the board. It has no purpose outside of elections. This is simply for the purpose of selecting the board members. It doesn't change the rest of the board's governance. It's not like somebody's going to say, I'm the representative only from Redwood City, so I only represent Redwood City, or it doesn't change other functions of how the board works, but it does serve to help elect the board members. And so you can think of these boundaries that we'll be talking about as only being operative on election day. Outside of election day, they have no real purpose. Redistricting is the process of redoing the districting every 10 years, and it's required in order to rebalance districts so that their population is equal and address any Voting Rights Act or other issues that could come from changes in how the district is laid out in its population, its ethnicity, maybe other issues that come up. Most people, when I say that I do redistricting, the only thing they can remember is gerrymandering. And the gerrymander, or technically the Garymander because it was Governor Gary, was a political cartoon actually, where they took a district that was drawn and made it look kind of like this salamander dragon and called it a Garymander after Governor Gary. Now this is the old-timey, like we don't think of redistricting as still doing this, but in the 2001 legislative redistricting, they created this district for the guy who became the Senate Pro Tem, Kevin De Leon. That district doesn't exist anymore, but it is kind of an example of one of these weird shaped districts that kind of looks like a gerrymander. We're going to try to follow criteria and use a districting process that's going to avoid things that would be considered gerrymanders. And if you actually took a political science class and you dug into the districting process, this is one little graphic, there's many others like it, that shows why gerrymandering can have an impact, especially in partisan elections. If you have a fictional town with a very small Democratic majority, you could draw districts like this, and this would allow 2 Democrats to get elected and 1 Republican district. Or if it was gerrymandered to kind of work against that Democratic majority, you could draw this. And in that version, now you can elect 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat. That's how gerrymandering works. But the fact is, in the dozens of redistrictings that I've worked on in local government, not once has partisanship become an issue. Instead of thinking about parties, what we end up having is things like rural versus urban, downtown versus the hillsides, of people who live near the airport or away from the airport, people who live in the LGBT community versus people who live in the older, wider community, and so on. When we draw districts to try to avoid gerrymandering, we utilize a number of different criteria, some of which are in statute, some of which are based on case law, and these are the primary criteria that we use, and these are the processes used no matter where you're districting in the country. First is relatively equal size. And what that means is that each district you draw is going to be equal in size, so that anybody represented by one of the districts has an equal piece of that governance. They have an equal share of that representation from that elected official. Now, when we talk about this, we're going to talk about population based on the 2010 U.S. Census, and that will be redone in the 2020 U.S. Census. The census isn't perfect, but we treat it as if it is perfect. And we're going to try when we draw, I'll get into it a little bit in a second, but we're going to try when we draw these districts, I say relatively equal size. If we were here drawing congressional districts, we would draw them to almost perfect equal size with a variation of only by one person. So every congressional district in California is 709,902 people, as opposed to when we talk about a district, we might say that one district might be 2.5% larger, another district might be 2.5% smaller, but we're going to try to keep it nice, tight, close to equal size. Districts are going to be contiguous. Contiguous means that they're whole parts. They don't start in one part and then kind of like disappear and pop up somewhere else. There have been redistrictings or districtings around the state, even in California, where a water district drew a district that was one city and then moved over and then was another town on the other side of the area. So they try to draw districts that don't touch. The only place where districts don't touch is when the land masses don't touch. So like Catalina Island. Catalina Island is drawn in the same district as the city of Long Beach because the argument is that if you're taking the ferry to Catalina, you're probably coming from Long Beach. So they did it that way. But we're not going to have any reason in this district to draw any pieces that don't touch. Maintaining communities of interest. This is where we get into the meat of what we need from the public in this process. Communities of interest are people and how they view themselves and how they view themselves with respect to the agency that is being districted. And that's an important thing to think about. A community of interest for a school district might have to do with where kids live, might have to do where parents have issues, might have to do with where kids are going to different community colleges, or it might have to do with educational attainment around the district. When somebody's drawing a water board isn't really going to think about those same things. It might think about, we were talking about this at the last meeting, it might think about where almonds are grown or where people use water for residential purposes. When we talk about communities of interest, there are communities of interest that are more important than all other communities of interest, and those are the communities of interest that are protected by the Federal Voting Rights Act. Largely, when we talk about those communities of interest, we're talking about Latinos, Asians, and African Americans. There are others. There could be in San Diego County, in El Centro, there's a community of Iraqi-born Catholics called Chaldeans. And in that community, the nationality/religion of the individuals could be used as a protected class, just like Latinos, Asians, and African Americans. Even in the statewide redistricting process, I was one of the consultants that worked on helping the State Redistricting Commission recognize LGBT community as one of these communities of interest with this kind of protection, meaning that you could identify them and they are a protected class. There's other communities of interest that kind of fall secondarily to those communities of interest, and these would include things like people living near for our case, people living near a harbor, or people living near a transportation hub. It could be communities based on age, or it could be communities based on how transient a population, maybe like a community near a college. I did a community redistricting in Santa Barbara, and there's a community that is entirely college students. Environmental interests, homeowners and renters and other things can be utilized as these kind of like secondary communities of interest. And a lot of this requires listening to the public or board members about what those communities of interest might be in your area and how those communities of interest might reflect the services that the Harbor District is providing to them. Following city and county and local government lines. This essentially means that if there are boundaries already on the map, they're probably there for a reason. The city of Redwood City has a boundary, its exterior boundary. We can look at that, and if all things are equal, and we're drawing a line somewhere around the boundary of Redwood City, we could say, well, we're gonna just adopt the external boundary of Redwood City and utilize that as part of our lines. There's nothing in state or federal law that requires us to, as an example, keep cities whole. In the statewide redistricting for legislative, congressional, Board of Equalization, you know, those districts that are drawn by the state commission, they actually have a rule in place that says they're supposed to not split cities and not split counties. They ended up having to do that because of those higher criteria we talked about, but if we can do it without having to split cities and counties, it's a good practice. It also makes it easier for the voters. You know you live in Redwood City, you know you're represented by this member of the Harbor District versus if you live in another city. Keeping districts compact. It was earlier mentioned about some districts being very huge. And that happens in an area like this, where we might have a district that incorporates a lot of open land that is not going to be small, but it can still be drawn in a way that is as compact as possible given the shape and size of the population. And what that means is more circles and squares, fewer serpents and eels and snakes and rivers and things like that. More drawing districts that have a natural square or circular size in order to make them as compact as possible. So the California Voting Rights Act takes federal law and essentially liberalizes it, makes it easier for plaintiffs. Under federal law, if you can prove that an election system is hurting a protected class, you can sue under federal law. This could be they're not providing enough polling places. It could be the butterfly ballot in Florida. It could be a poll tax. Any of those kinds of things would fall under the banner of an election system that is harming the protected classes. In this case, you could make an argument in some parts of the state that the at-large election system is violating federal law because it's impacting these protected classes. However, in federal law, you have to prove a couple things that you don't have to prove in state law. In federal law, you have to prove not only that there's racially polarized voting, which means a difference in voting patterns, you have to prove that it has a difference in outcomes, that the outcomes would be different had you not had the at-large system. You don't have to prove that in the state law. The state law just says, is there racially polarized voting? Federal law requires you to prove that it has an outcome problem. Under state law, under the California Voting Rights Act, you have to draw go to district lines if the racially polarized voting and creation of districts would allow for communities of interest to influence the outcome of an election. Meaning, under state law, if I can draw a district around a part of the county, and it would allow for the Asian population to influence the outcome of the election, which is an undefined number, then we have to draw districts. Under federal law, they don't care about influence. You only have to draw districts if that ethnic population can reach 50% or greater. It can be a majority-minority district. So essentially, the state law takes what's federal law around racially polarized voting, creation of districts, the requirements under majority-minority, and it liberalizes all of those criteria. Another thing about federal law is you can go to court in federal law and be in federal court for years and not be sure that you're going to get anything back in terms of payment for the attorneys that are suing. State law fixed that for attorneys and said, if you sue, you're guaranteed $30,000 if you follow one particular process, and if you don't follow this process, you could have unlimited amount of money that you're making from a lawsuit. In California, we've seen several of these lawsuits that had very significant legal costs, and these are just the plaintiff reimbursements. This doesn't include the amount that the districts paid in the lawsuits. What essentially the law has done, and I was thinking about this earlier, because it's kind of, I'm not trying to be silly, but there's a safe harbor under the current law. and that's what they're calling it. The safe harbor is you can face a lawsuit and follow your own process and do it on your own timeline, and you can be subject to fees of unlimited amount. However, if you follow the process that we're following, which is a succession of several meetings within a tight time frame, a period right now where we're not drawing maps, followed by a period after maps have been drawn, and then a final approval at a meeting where the maps can't be changed. The process, we could talk about it in more detail. Kim's the expert on it. If we follow this process, we're guaranteed that no attorneys can sue for more than $30,000. And so what we have is, under the old process, unlimited fees. Under the new process, at least there's one opportunity that if you follow these certain prescribed steps, you don't have to pay exorbitant legal fees. When we go in and look for when we do redistricting analysis, we are looking at these ideas of minority subgroups, of racially polarized voting, and whether or not the creation of districts will allow for the communities that we're looking at to influence the outcome of the elections. When we look at the district just from afar, we can see that we have just over 750,000 residents based on the population of the 2010 census. This means everybody, kids, citizens, non-citizens, prisoners, if there's any prisons in the county, I'm not actually even sure, so on and so forth. Each district under this equal population would be roughly 145,000 people. When we use that idea of saying we're going to keep these districts relatively equal in size and a little buffer of a few percent over, a few percent below that 144, we're going to have districts where there'll be approximately 140,000 people to 147,000 people. When we look at the district and look at the cities underlying it, we can see, as an example, the Daly City. Daly City is about, 65% of one district in terms of its population size. We have other cities and their population. These are all recognized by the U.S. Census. These can be used. In addition to these cities, do we have the map? No. Yeah. In addition to these cities, we do have a number of census places, which are unincorporated areas that are also recognized by the census and can be utilized in the redistricting. This is essentially how those look. We have a number of incorporated cities, and then a lot of these down here, like El Granada, and these are all unincorporated areas. But they're treated, for the purposes of our districting, we'll treat those like we would a city because it allows us to see a concentration of people who self-identify as being from Mahonda, as an example.
Can I ask you a
Yes.
question, Paul? I don't see East Palo Alto on here, which has about 35,000 people, unless I'm missing it. 30 to 30, I don't see East Palo Alto on here.
I don't know why, that's weird, I can look at it. If it needs to be put in there, I'll add it to the.
Well, they need to be put in there.
Yeah.
They're probably one of the areas
Yeah.
that would justify district elections.
Yeah, I'm sure they're in this map, right? It just might be that
Well,
for some reason.
they're in
they
the
didn't-
southeast
They're down here, right?
area of, no, they're actually east of, what's the line?
This right
What's
here?
that, yeah, that's the
That's West
county
Menlo
line.
Park.
Yeah, no, it's to the east. So is that is the bold line the county line?
This is Santa Clara County down here?
Yeah, so it's gonna literally be at the bottom southeast
Right.
corner.
Okay,
Just about that, yeah.
okay, yeah, sure, I'll have to look in the database and see why maybe just when I converted it from the mapping software, it didn't pick it up for some reason. So I'll fix that before the next presentation.
Thank you.
When we looked at the district, we do find, first off, that the district has ethnic populations, 1/4 Asian and 17% Latino based on the citizen voting age population. This is going to be an interesting concept. We're going to talk about population on one hand based on the total U.S. Census based on the 2010 short form. Then the census utilizes something called the American Community Survey. 1 out of every 6 households over a 10-year period is going to get a census long form. That long form asks a lot of things. How long does it take you to commute to work? How many bedrooms does your house have? When was your house built? All this data is included in the census long form. That census long form will allow us to get data from the federal government that estimates the number of people that are eligible to vote, citizens, and different ethnic groups. And so that's what we're going to utilize when we draw districts. When we look at the Asian population, we can see the concentration of the Asian population as we see. And is this East Palo Alto right there maybe?
No, it's further east. It's literally on the Santa Clara, San Mateo County border.
Well, this is the Santa Clara, San Bernardino.
No,
It's in that-
but
it's
to
in that
the-
little corner.
It's literally in the corner.
Yep.
That right there, right?
East,
Yeah, that may be, yeah.
That's what I was
No,
thinking.
no, I don't know. It's
I'll look
hard
it up
to
before we
say.
leave.
It's
I
hard
can
to
look it up.
say. It's,
I can look it up on my software, it's not a problem. So when we look at the Latinos, we see the same kind of concentration. We also see this one over here that's very large. This is a census block group. This might only be 1,500 people, or it might even be a few hundred people. But, you know, it might be a little bit of an anomaly. This might just be like heavily Latino as a percentage, even though it's raw numbers, it's not nearly as many people as you might see over here in North Fair Oaks, where you do have a high Latino density.
would that be considered rural, that big part?
Yeah, it's definitely
very
rural
rural
area.
area.
Yeah, definitely rural. When I see a census block group that is this huge,
Yeah,
that means that the population is very spread out.
small.
Just like this one. This might be one census block group that goes all the way up like this. Meaning that the census is basically clumped all these people together for the purposes of analysis, which means that it's a huge area. So when we look at the density, which is also an interesting thing to think about when you're drawing district lines, we see this very high density through this corridor of the 280-101
Yes.
and relatively low density everywhere else. And that's going to be something we're going to see when we draw district lines. We're going to see that over here, we're drawing districts, and it's almost like all the districts are on one side of the county, when in reality, it's simply because of the population density differences. So the next steps that we have, after I find the city list on here to update that slide, is we're going to use these community meetings to identify what might be communities of interest. It can be the board giving this input, it can be the public, it can be people who are emailing in, who are seeing something like this on TV and emailing in what they believe are their communities of interest. We'll also look at how the locations of facilities, property that's owned by the district, and other things might influence the drawing of lines. And then we'll take steps to show the community our desire to have input. We have a series of meetings that have been scheduled, and I believe those meetings are on the website. Is that? And so this is only the second one. We'll have some meetings that are being done in concert with actual board meetings, and some meetings that are simply like this that are exclusively for the public to come and attend. So with that, thank you, and I'll look up this one, the city listing, see how I missed one.
Thank you.
Thank you.